And look what Jesus says to this church. I know your works. And this is the word know, to be aware of, proceed. I know thy works. And right after he says, I know thy works, immediately he mentions what happened to those in Smyrna for doing the work. I know thy works, tribulation. You say, my tribute, hold it. Yeah, I know your works, tribulation. Thalipsis is the Greek word. He says, I know you, it's 45 times in the New Testament, and it's an interesting word because it means pressure, constraints are rubbed together. Something rubbed together. And this word is used like a narrow place that hems someone in, like you don't have nowhere to get out of. You're hemmed in, especially internal pressure. Internal pressure that causes someone to have a sense of being confined or restricted without options or no way to escape. That's what they experienced in Smyrna. The pressure was on. He says, I know your works, your tribulation, and poverty or beggary or destitution, it means. But look what he says. Look how Jesus saw this church. But you are rich. Plesios is the word. You are rich is derived from the word that means abundance. You have an abundance, fully resourced, rich, filled, having God's, one word, we don't use it, God's muchness. You are rich. We think of riches in a whole different terminology. We say rich, I don't want to be rich, but I'm talking about money. Jesus says, no. Jesus saw this church. He says, I know your works and your poverty. He says, you're poor, but you're rich. They must have came in, confiscated all their properties and things for believing in Christ, stripping them from their families and all that stuff, all the things we love, taking everything that was human, any human value to some degree. And Jesus says, oh, you're poor, your tribulations. I know your works is tribulation and poverty. He says, but you're rich. The church in Laodicea, they thought they were rich. He said, you're blind, naked, miserable, you're wretched. They thought they were rich, and Jesus, no, this is the rich church. Well, which church is the rich church? With the great edifice? No, not really. The church with the great bank account? No, not really. Not in the eyes of Christ. The church with the biggest crowd and is filled in the stadium? No, not in the eyes of the Lord. Learn church from God's perspective, not our perspective. Learn it from God's perspective. Don't learn it from your own perspective. You have a skewed or a foggy view or a murky view of what church really looks like from the eyes of Jesus Christ. And it is his church. He says that you guys are rich. Although poor, they were rich in the sight of Jesus Christ. Remember what Paul wrote? Paul says, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. Possessing all things. Note, in Smyrna, it is likely, highly likely, they didn't have a good sound system. They didn't have the best building. They didn't have tons of money in the bank. They didn't have professional lighting. They didn't have a wonderful professional band. They didn't have a youth ministry. They didn't have salaries to get a pastoral staff. I know a lot about that. They didn't have the greatest orators coming from around the world hoping they could share their pulpits. They didn't have air conditioning. We know about that, right? Lighting. They didn't have a huge budget or own large amounts of land, and the list goes on. They didn't have these things, but they were called rich. How in the world could they be called rich when he just said they were a church of poverty? How in the world? And one of the most important things that they did have that made them rich was their communion and their relationship with Jesus Christ. So it made them rich.